Welcome to ID the Future, a podcast about intelligent design and evolution.
Greetings and welcome to the Intelligent Design the Future podcast. I'm Casey Luskin, broadcasting from Discovery Institute's Center for Science and Culture in Seattle, Washington. Today we have on the phone with us Professor Brad Monton, Associate Professor of Philosophy at the University of Colorado Boulder, who has written a number of articles and has written a book on intelligent design and comes at it from a very interesting and unique perspective. Before we get going, I want to note that Professor Monton will be debating intelligent design and the existence of God this coming Friday, November 7th in Fort Worth, Texas at the Will Rogers Auditorium, and then also on Saturday, November 8th at the St. Andrew's Episcopal Church, also in Fort Worth, Texas. And on the pro-ID side of this debate will be, as it turns out, two non-theists, Professor Monton and David Berlinski, and then on the anti-ID side will be Dennis Alexander and Lawrence Krauss. If you'd like more information about attending the debate, visit idthefuture.com, and we'll have that information up there for you. So go check it out Friday and Saturday in Fort Worth, Texas, Intelligent Design and the Existence of God, and the information's at idthefuture.com if you'd like to attend. So Professor Monton, thank you so much for joining us on the ID the Future podcast today.
You're welcome.
I'd like for our listeners to first get to know you a little bit. Some of our listeners who follow the ID debate might know your name and might have followed your work. Others who even follow it closely might not have heard of you, and I really hope that that will change in the future. Just to give a little bit of background, I first discovered you, Professor Monton, a couple years ago when I was working on a law review article that ended up being published in Montana Law Review that was reviewing the Kitzmiller ruling. And as I was writing on it, I was doing some research on philosophy of science, particularly philosophers who have made the argument that something doesn't have to be correct for it to be scientific, that you could be scientific and you could yet be wrong. And in doing that research on the internet, I came across an article you had written about the constitutionality of teaching intelligent design, and you were critiquing Judge Jones' arguments that an ID is not science, and I found your viewpoint to be very refreshing and very compelling, and it happened to cohere with some of the arguments that we were making, and so we ended up citing your work quite a bit in our law review article, which I enjoyed reading very much. So, Professor Monton, I'd love for our listeners to get to know you a little bit. So, could you first give us a little bit of background? Just what is your educational background, and sort of where do you come from intellectually in this debate?
Sure. I am an atheist, which would most people would think that would mean that would be a virulent anti-intelligent design person. And I'm not. I actually find some of the intelligent design arguments at least somewhat plausible and worth taking seriously within academia. And I'm unhappy with the sort of unfair and false criticisms that a lot of my fellow philosophers and academics have given of intelligent design. I'm also, for the record, unhappy with some of the intelligent design arguments. I think that even though some of them are wrong, they could actually be given better than current intelligent design proponents are giving them. So I'm trying really to elevate the debate on both sides. I got interested in these issues through my background in philosophy of physics, actually. I got a PhD from Princeton in 1999 in philosophy, specializing in philosophy of physics. And then I got interested in probability theory, and I can't remember how I first came across it, but I started reading about the fine-tuning argument as an argument for the existence of God or some sort of cosmic designer that is a probabilistic physics-based argument. And so I was unhappy with what both sides of the argument were saying, and so I wrote this paper called God, Fine-Tuning, and the Problem of Old Evidence, which is available on my website, which is bradleymonton.com. And in that paper, I tried to say that the fine-tuning argument was a somewhat plausible argument, but not an argument that would force one to believe in God or some sort of cosmic designer. And from there, I got interested in science-based arguments for the existence of God more generally, and that, of course, led me into the whole intelligent design literature.
So you did your PhD in philosophy at Princeton, and you focused on, you said, philosophy of physics. Could you maybe tell us a bit more about what you studied in your PhD?
Yeah, there I was working on philosophy of quantum mechanics, particularly like what quantum mechanics basically says strange things about the way the world is, but different versions of quantum mechanics, different interpretations of quantum mechanics say different things about how the world is strange. And obviously one could get more specific, but that's the basic idea. And so my dissertation was basically going through different versions of quantum mechanics and trying to figure out exactly what they're saying about the world and exactly how observers are represented in the theory.
So when you're at a dinner party trying to describe somebody while you studying your PhD, is that sort of how you boil it down? Because I know another person like you who studied philosophy of physics. Actually, it's Bruce Gordon here at the Discovery Institute. And I got to say, I mean, it is one of the most intellectual heavyweight subjects I think you can wade into. So
yeah. I'm certainly glad I'm doing it. I mean, I went into, physics as an undergraduate thinking that I wanted to discover fundamental truths about the nature of the world. And I didn't even know what philosophy was. And then when I was a freshman, I took a humanities class, and we read the Book of Job as part of this interdisciplinary humanities class. And my professor in that class took the opportunity to tell us about the sort of standard philosophical arguments for and against the existence of God. And that was my first introduction to philosophy, and I was hooked, and I still think that that's like one of the most important issues that philosophers could discuss. Because obviously, whether God exists or not is like a fundamentally important issue in terms of how to understand the world. Maybe, I mean, it can be an important issue in terms of how you live your life, right? If you're a Christian versus an atheist, you're hopefully going to live your life differently.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I'm sure you as an atheist would I'm sure like to say that atheists tend to be moral people, and I certainly have known many atheists. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I have known many atheists who were very, very moral people. So, I certainly am not somebody who says that if you become an atheist somehow but you know what I'm saying.
For the record, I believe in objective morality, even though I'm an atheist, and I can give you my quick argument as to why, if you want to hear that. But what I was thinking of is that there are some people who call themselves Christians, but they're sort of like CE Christians. They go to church on Christmas and Easter, and that's about it.
Sure.
And then there are other people, who go on mission trips and try to proselytize and take this sort of worldview that Christianity provides really seriously and work to try to understand that worldview better and work to do apologetics for that worldview. I guess maybe this is just my personal statement of what I'm like, but if I were to be a Christian, I would be a Christian like that, where I would be like defending the worldview. I would join the Discovery Institute now.
Well, we have non-Christians here as well, believe it or not. There are folks who are agnostics that are involved with the ID issue here at Discovery, but I can definitely appreciate what you say. I think that and I think that we can find some common ground here. That there are people of many worldviews who kind of don't think about the bigger picture issues in life. They kind of skate through, not asking the hard questions, not wanting the hard questions to influence the way they live their lives, not really seeking to sort of better themselves through a lot of self-introspection. I think that there are people in many worldviews who do that, and people in many worldviews who don't do that. In some ways, I feel more kinship with the atheist who is very self-introspective and takes these issues very seriously than I do myself being a Christian, than I do with the Christian who just doesn't care about these bigger picture questions. And as you said, goes to church twice a year and just doesn't think very much about these kind of things. So I enjoy these debates, as I'm sure you do as well.
Yeah, so I appreciate your attitude there. That's conciliant with mine, and this whole all explains why I'm interested in the intelligent design debate. Because even though I'm an atheist, I'm not absolutely certain of my atheism. I think that one can call oneself an atheist without being like absolutely dogmatic, without being willing to bet one's life for a penny that atheism is true. Just as, I know theists who have doubts. Mother Teresa had doubts. Al Plantinga, who's a friend of mine, and as people probably know, a famous Christian philosopher, he has doubts sometimes. But, these people are still theists, and the atheists can similarly believe that God doesn't exist without being absolutely certain that God doesn't exist.
What do you think happens when a person tries to pretend that there is no reason or room for any doubt or self-introspection in their worldview?
Yeah, this is where I think that leads to dogmatism in part, and this sort of emotional reaction to the people who are on the other side. Because if you think that the other side is just completely, has nothing going for it, then you're going to, dismiss them and react badly to them. And it's unfortunate, and I appreciate the people who aren't that way. And unfortunately, what I've been encountering lately are more atheists who seem to be completely incredibly dogmatic about their view, and then, at least in my personal experience, I've been encountering Christians who are more sympathetic. Like, I recently came across, for example, William Lane Craig, and he has a Q&A section on his web page, where he said, and I'm paraphrasing here, but he basically said, it was question number 72, if you want to look it up. He basically said, atheism is not an implausible worldview. So this is, Craig, one of the preeminent Christian apologists, saying atheism is not an implausible worldview. But then his reason for saying that is he was saying, so that doesn't explain why these atheists are giving such bad arguments and being so emotional about it. They should be able to just give, plausible arguments for atheism, but in fact they're not. They're getting, all upset and not giving arguments.
I find your perspective very interesting, Professor Monton. I'm interested in this debate. I'm supposed to be interviewing you, but you've just really sparked my interest here. I'm interested in this debate on many levels. One is just because I personally consider myself a person who is seeking truth and is trying to understand what is the nature of reality. And then as well, I'm interested also in just people and the way that we're built, the way that we approach these kind of issues. And having been on the receiving end of a lot of what you might call the dogmatic name calling that's out there, I think about that kind of stuff and I wonder what drives it, what causes it, why do people get so angry? I wrote a blog post earlier this year about how Richard Dawkins and Lawrence Krauss were just really, they had this sort of hate fest on religion where I watched them speak at Stanford back in March, and I said, in many ways, they're coming to resemble the very thing that they claim they hate. And,
right.
It saddens me because I love a good introspective dialogue and discussion and debate with anybody of any viewpoint. And so that's why, whether they agree with ID or they don't, and when it turns into dogmatism and name calling, it just saddens me. I think that the debate could be so much more interesting and so much more life-giving than that.
Right. Yeah, I absolutely agree. And you could sort of understand why scientists maybe are that way, at least if you have like the Kuhnian view that there are paradigms and people are practicing normal science. Then within normal science nowadays, it's not appropriate to consider supernatural hypotheses or even the sorts of design hypotheses that the intelligent design people want folks to consider. But within philosophy, philosophers are used to talking about arguments for and against the existence of God. And it's kind of, it's sort of one of the paradigm issues that philosophers talk about. And so it really surprises me when I get philosophers who are being dogmatic and opposed to me talking about these issues.
Professor Monton, is there anything else you'd like to add just as we close out this first interview?
Yeah, we were in the topic of reactions, the negative reactions I've gotten for trying to discuss these intelligent design issues in a dispassionate, objective manner. I thought it might be interesting to read part of an email I got from a prominent intelligent design proponent. And I'm not going to mention his name.
Proponent or opponent?
Prominent intelligent design opponent.
Opponent, okay.
Opponent, right. And I'm not going to mention his name just because it doesn't really matter
Sure.
who he is. What's interesting is the attitude that's expressed. So he says, unfortunately, so he read an early draft of my manuscript on intelligent design issues, which we can talk more about. And here's what he said. Unfortunately, in this debate, a position between two sides, which you seem to adopt, is hardly tenable. It is a cultural war whose outcome will have immense consequences. So a book, to be useful, must unequivocally take a side and defend it vigorously. A position of supposed impartiality, which is hardly possible, necessarily serves one side, despite the author's intention to remain unbiased. And I was really disappointed when I got this idea that I have to be on one side or the other, that this is a cultural war, and one can't take any side other than one of the two sides cultural war. That really disappointed me because I'm not working on intelligent design issues to be useful. I'm not working on intelligent design issues to fight a cultural war, even if there is a cultural war, which we can talk about. I'm talking about these intelligent design issues, and I'm thinking about these because I want to get at the truth. I want to know, or at least even if I can't get at the truth, I want to know where the arguments best point. So, I'm not interested in taking one side and defending it vigorously. I'm interested in espousing what I think the right position is. And if I think the right position is somewhere in between, then that's what I'm going to say.
Well, I appreciate your perspective very much, Professor Monton. Us folks who have been involved with the legal field have a term for that kind of thinking, that the quote that you just read, it's called outcome-based jurisprudence, where people don't care about the logic or the reasoning that you use to get to your conclusion. They just care about your conclusion, that it's the quote-unquote politically correct, accurate conclusion as far as their own goals and agenda is concerned. Good reasoning and logic and truth are not of primary concern when you do that kind of reasoning. So
right.
In any case, we're going to pick this up in another podcast, talk some more about your own research and the book that you're writing, and maybe even get back into the question of responses to your work and your perspective on those kind of things. So thank you so much, Professor Monton, for this interview.
Thanks, Casey.
This is Casey Luskin with the ID of the Future podcast. Stay tuned for more with Professor Bradley Monton. And don't forget that this weekend, Dr. Monton will be upholding the pro-ID side in a debate over intelligent design and the existence of God in Fort Worth, Texas. Check out idthefuture.com for all the details. Thanks for listening.
This program was recorded by Discovery Institute's Center for Science and Culture. ID the Future is copyright Discovery Institute 2008. For more information, visit www.intelligentdesign.org or www.idthefuture.com. Welcome to ID the Future, a podcast about intelligent design and evolution.
Hello and welcome back to the ID the Future podcast. I'm Casey Luskin with Professor Bradley Monton of the University of Colorado Boulder, talking again about his book, Seeking God in Science, An Atheist Defends Intelligent Design, published by Broadview Press. Professor Monton, thanks for coming back on the show with us again to discuss your book.
Thanks for having me.
In the first part of the show, we talked about some of the introductory sections of your book about defining intelligent design and trying to sweep aside many common misrepresentations that we see about ID among its critics. And as I want to reiterate, I think that your book does an excellent job of getting past the really fallacious objections to ID and trying to hone in on what ID is so that then you can evaluate the arguments. But I think that before we can even get to that stage, there's one more roadblock that's been thrown up to really getting to an actual discussion of ID, and that is the Dover ruling. I mean, I can't tell you how often, and I'm sure you get this too, Professor Monton, where you're talking about ID and somebody just says, well, didn't some federal judge rule that it's religion, and doesn't that kind of settle the issue? I mean, do you experience that ever?
Yes, sometimes. Although, one of the good things about philosophers is that they tend not to appeal to federal judges. So that's something to be said on behalf of my profession, but certainly I hear that. Everyday people.
That must be one of the good parts of being a philosopher, is they're stubborn. You guys think for yourselves, that's for sure.
Exactly. But there are philosophers out there who agree with the judge's decision in Dover. Robert Pennock being the primary one. He testified during the Dover trial, and the judge relied heavily on Pennock's testimony in writing up that section of his decision, from what I understand, the section that claims that intelligent design is not science. I wrote just an online paper, just sort of offhand, criticism of the judge's decision, and it ended up getting lots of press, and Pennock got really upset at my criticism of the judge's decision. And so chapter 2 of my book goes into all that issue. What's wrong with the judge's decision? What's wrong with Pennock's reasoning? What's wrong with Pennock's criticisms of me?
Well, let's get into that real quick here, Professor Monton. And actually, Chapter 2 is one of my favorite parts of your book, where you critique the Dover ruling. It was actually that paper that you wrote that I read that first introduced me to your work. I was very impressed by it. So just for our listeners who are maybe not experts in philosophy of science, because I think this is important to define before we go any further, can you explain to us what is a demarcation criterion and how does that play into this debate?
So philosophers have talked a lot about what the demarcation criterion is between science and non-science. What you want is ideally, you want a statement that says, X is a scientific theory if and only if. Or a person P is doing science if and only if. And then you fill in the blank with what it takes to do science or what it takes to be a scientific theory. And it's become remarkably hard to come up with such a demarcation criterion. Though some people, like Pennock, think that there are at least necessary conditions. Pennock thinks that if you appeal to supernatural hypotheses, then you're not doing science. And that's called the doctrine of methodological naturalism. And this is a doctrine that the judge endorses in his Dover decision. And I think, well, first of all, as we discussed in the previous podcast, intelligent design is not inherently supernatural. That's one claim I make. But also, even if it were inherently supernatural, that doesn't rule it out as being automatically unscientific, because I think the doctrine of methodological naturalism is false. I think it's perfectly reasonable for scientists to consider supernatural claims. Now, in fact, I think that there's not much evidence for the truth of supernatural claims. That's why I'm an atheist. But the claims are at least worth considering, and it's worth evaluating what the evidence is. And we shouldn't just dismiss the claims by saying that they're non-scientific.
I'm not convinced that ID violates methodological naturalism. As far as I'm concerned, you can take methodological naturalism for granted, and ID does not necessarily violate it. Going back to Pennock, you write in your book that, quote, if one uses Pennock's testimony, one can call a statement true, even though that statement is actually false. Because the concept of truth one is using when one calls a statement true is the concept of mere naturalistic truth. Could you elaborate on that a little bit and why you feel that methodological naturalism is therefore an inappropriate stricture, an arbitrary stricture perhaps, on the scientific enterprise?
Sure. Pennock has what really, to a philosopher, is a hilarious discussion, but hilariously bad. I've showed it to other philosophers who have no bone to pick in this debate, and they are rolling their eyes. Pennock's not going to like me saying this, but it's really unimpressive. Pennock distinguishes between what he calls merely naturalistic scientific truths and ontological metaphysical absolute truths. This distinction does not appear anywhere in philosophy. It's a distinction that he made up. It's a really bad distinction to make. Philosophers typically treat the word truth univocally. It has a single meaning. There are some claims that are true and there are other claims that are false. We don't distinguish between two types of truth, these merely naturalistic scientific truths and these ontological metaphysical absolute truths. But by Pennock's terminology, a merely naturalistic scientific truth can actually be false. So when a scientist says something is true, by Pennock's lights, that scientist may well be saying something false, like it's really and truly false. But it's true because it's what one would conclude if one followed methodological naturalism. So if one followed methodological naturalism, one would reach some particular conclusion, and that makes it a merely naturalistic scientific truth. But that may actually be a false claim, because it may be that reality isn't that way. It's insane, but it's hilarious, too. In that section of the book, I explain it clearly, more clearly than I just have here in the podcast, what Pennock's up to and why it doesn't make any sense.
Well, I would certainly encourage listeners to check out your book, which again is titled Seeking God in Science, An Atheist Defends Intelligent Design, published by Broadview Press, because it certainly does explain these things very clearly. One of the other points I thought that you made very forcefully in your book was a critique of Judge Jones' demarcation criteria that ID is not science because allegedly its negative attacks on evolution have been refuted by the scientific community. Why is that particular criterion not a good measure of whether or not something is science?
The reason that's not a good measure is that there are other claims that have been refuted by the scientific community that people still consider to be scientific claims. For example, Newtonian physics has been refuted by the scientific community. Newtonian physics predicts that clocks run at the same rate regardless of what gravitational field they're in. And in fact, that's false. General relativity predicts that that's false, and the empirical evidence confirms that that's false. Now, Newtonian physics is a very useful theory in various realms. And, that plus other factors mean that it's still a scientific theory. So you can't rule out Newtonian physics as unscientific just because it's false. So if we're going to rule out, if Judge Jones wants to rule out intelligent design as unscientific, it's going to take more than the claim that intelligent design is false. It could be just a false scientific theory, just like Newtonian physics is.
Now, Professor Monton, at this point I'd like to ask you if you agree with Philip Kitcher, who says that these arguments that ID is not science are not very helpful. He would say that ID is a science, it's just a dead science. And is that perhaps a little bit closer to your viewpoint and kind of the perspective that you just elaborated on?
Yes, that's closer to my viewpoint. Although I wouldn't want to call intelligent design a dead science because I think that there is some evidence for the existence of this sort of designer that intelligent design proponents talk about. And if there is such a designer, I'm inclined to think that that designer would count as God. So one reason I find the intelligent design arguments interesting is that they do lead me to question my atheism. I'm less certain of an atheist than I would be had I not heard the intelligent design arguments. So to call it a dead science means it's like, Aristotelian physics. It doesn't have any sort of evidential force anymore. And I don't think that's the case. I think, for me at least, the arguments do have some evidential force. And not enough to convince me to change my view about the truth of theism.
Well, I would certainly agree with you that ID is not a dead science. Kitcher's one of his main examples of why ID is dead science is allegedly the presence of non-coding and non-functional junk DNA in the cell. And of course, in the last couple of years, the whole idea of junk DNA is really being overturned. So I would say that if anything is becoming dead science, it's the idea of junk DNA. But I think that ID certainly is very potent, and I'd agree with you there. Let's get into one last part of Chapter 2. And we might have talked about this a little bit during an interview that we did with you last year. But this Chapter 2, as you said, was based upon a paper that you published critiquing the Dover ruling. And it did cause a little bit of a stir, particularly with Robert Pennock, who, as you noted, you critiqued in this chapter. So maybe could you give us a short, brief synopsis of that episode and where people can go to get more information about this little scenario that took place?
Sure. Pennock emailed me after I posted my paper critiquing the judge's ruling online. And Pennock told me that I had to pull my paper off the internet and basically issued a veiled legalistic threat. And I was really appalled by this. This struck me as a classic case of intimidation and an attempt at suppression. And I did not pull my paper off the internet. But since then, this has become a bit, this issue of Pennock emailing me has been discussed other places. I think UKC wrote something in U.S. News and World Report on the online edition where you talked about tactics of suppression and intimidation that intelligent design opponents use. And you mentioned Pennock's email to me as one such example. And Pennock took issue with that and tried to explain in his own U.S. News and World Report online column why he sent me that email, and he got a number of facts wrong. And so I wrote something up setting Pennock straight and just going through point by point and showing why Pennock is saying false or misleading or confused things. You can access that if you just go to bradleymonton.org. So my first name and my last name, bradleymonton.org, and that redirects to my write-up of that. And I think it's worth reading. It's pretty interesting to see how, even in the course of Pennock saying that he's not being intimidating or trying to suppress things, he ends up being intimidating and trying to suppress things.
Professor Monton, if you can stick with us for a third podcast, I'd like to end this second podcast right now talking about a related issue that's actually a hot topic right now, and you have a blog post on your blog, bradleymonton.wordpress.com, that talks about this episode, actually, where Michael Behe had an interview posted on the website Blogging Heads, and it was taken down and then reinstated by Robert Wright, and I think Robert Wright should be commended for reinstating this interview, even though many users of Blogging Heads apparently were very upset that he even posted an interview with Michael Behe. But all that aside, there's more facts that have just come out recently that some leading proponents of neo-Darwinism and sort of media proponents, people like Sean Carroll and Carl Zimmer, are now resigning from Blogging Heads because they're so upset that there's even an interview of Michael Behe that's been posted there. So staying with the theme of suppression of ID, what does this say to you when people are so upset that an interview with Michael Behe has been posted that they're resigning from a website over this issue? What do you think about this, and what do you make of all this, Professor Monton?
Yeah, it's a tough issue. I mean, there's a lot one could say about it. I think my initial reaction was to be disappointed in Zimmer and Carroll for withdrawing from Blogging Heads just because of these sorts of issues. Zimmer's reasoning was, he said that, and I'm going to read a quote from him, "My standard for taking part in any forum about science is pretty simple. All the participants must rely on peer-reviewed science." And I think that's actually already right there, I think that's a mistake. Peer-reviewed science is science that's sort of reached a certain stage where it's gone through, the process of being written up for evaluation and being agreed upon by other scientists and agreed that it should be published. If you look at the history of science and the history of scientific revolutions, there are lots of cases where when someone first proposes an idea, lots of people think it's crazy, lots of people think it's not worth taking seriously, and it ends up that idea, a scientific revolution happens, and lots of people end up thinking that idea is the right one. Basically, the revolutionary ideas come first, and peer review comes later. Now, in fact, Behe and others do have some peer-reviewed papers that are related to intelligent design. So I'm not saying that standard, the peer-reviewed science standard, rules out intelligent design. But what I'm saying is that sort of what he clearly has in mind is that it needs to be restricted to the sort of science that people have, at least a fair number of scientists have come to accept. That's what I'm reading into what he's saying there, at least. And I think that's a mistake. I think that it's okay to talk about revolutionary ideas. And Blogging Heads is an ideal forum where one is supposed to talk about interesting, new, and different ideas, and those are going to include revolutionary ideas in science. Now, lots of revolutionary ideas are probably going to be shown to be false in the long run, but the wrong ideas are still worth discussing somewhere. And it seems like a good place to discuss them would be on Blogging Heads before requiring that they go through the rigors of peer review.
And what I also find disturbing about this, Professor Monton, is that no one is forcing people like Carl Zimmer or Sean Carroll to talk about intelligent design. If they don't want to talk about it, that's their right. They are so upset that somebody else is talking about it that they have to resign from a website just because that website is posting a discussion of this topic. And, I mean, what does that say to you about their interest in academic freedom for others who might just want to talk about a subject, even if they don't want to talk about it?
Well, I mean, I think it relates to an interesting general issue. Step away from Behe's ideas. Imagine there's some intellectual controversy. Some people think the intellectual controversy isn't worth discussing, but some smart, educated people think the intellectual controversy is worth discussing. How should the people who think that it's not worth discussing behave towards the smart, educated people who think that it is worth discussing? My attitude is pretty much a live and let live one. Those people are smart and educated. They think it is worth discussing. So yes, it should be discussed. And I get the sense from Zimmer that he doesn't quite have that attitude. I get the sense that his view is that he wants to intellectually distance himself from those who think those ideas aren't worth discussing if he doesn't think the ideas are worth discussing. And I think that intellectual distancing is a mistake. I think it's helpful to be more open-minded on these matters. And I'm saying that, partly for general ideas relating to like intellectual freedom and how one engages in intellectual inquiry and how one comes up with new ideas. And I'm also saying that on the basis of actual historical facts about how scientific revolutions happen and how scientific changes happen. Typically, people come up with ideas at first that lots of people reject when a scientific revolution happens, and ideas get widely vilified, and then later they become widely accepted. And I'm not saying, for the record, I'm not saying that intelligent design is going to be one of those. I'm not saying intelligent design is going to lead to a scientific revolution and we're all going to start doing design-based science. But I think the idea is at least worth taking seriously, and I'm one of those smart, educated people who thinks it's worth talking about.
Well, I think there's a lot of smart and educated people out there who think it's worth talking about, and it's unfortunate that some other smart and educated people want to try to shut down that speech and prevent that speech from being freely spoken, basically. People right now are really going on the warpath to try to shut down even just other people talking about ID. This is a disturbing trend, I have to say. But Professor Monton, we are running out of time for this podcast. We're going to come back with you for more, talking about your new book, Seeking God in Science, an Atheist Defends Intelligent Design. Go check it out. Our listeners, it's published by Broadview Press, and it's available on Amazon.com, and I'm sure anywhere that good books are sold. So, Professor Monton, thanks for this second podcast with us about your book.
Thank you.
I'm Casey Luskin. Stay tuned again for more with Bradley Monton. Thanks for listening.
This program was recorded by Discovery Institute's Center for Science and Culture. ID The Future is copyright Discovery Institute 2008. For more information, visit www.intelligentdesign.org or www.idthefuture.com. Welcome to ID the Future, a podcast about intelligent design and evolution.
Can atheists defend intelligent design? I'm Casey Luskin, and on this podcast, we're going to once again speak with Professor Bradley J. Monton, Associate Professor of Philosophy at the University of Colorado Boulder, about his new book, Seeking God in Science, An Atheist Defends Intelligent Design, published by Broadview Press. This is our third interview with Professor Monton. On the first two, we talked about his book and how it tries to accurately define intelligent design and get past many of the common misdefinitions of intelligent design that are out there. And on this podcast, we have Professor Monton back with us to talk about his scientific analysis of intelligent design that he offers in his book. So, Professor Monton, thank you so much for coming back on the show with us.
Thanks for having me.
Well, on this podcast, I really want to get into some of the fun stuff, and that is the actual ID arguments. And I know that you were very careful in your definitions of IDs, we talked about in some of the earlier podcasts, to make it clear that ID is not just an argument for design in biology. It also applies within the field of physics and cosmology. And correct me if I'm wrong, but philosophy of physics is something of your area of specialty, is it not?
Right. The way I actually got into thinking about all these intelligent design issues is that I started thinking about the fine-tuning argument, which is a particular science-based argument for the existence of a designer. Because I was thinking about that, and I started thinking about other science-based arguments for the existence of a designer, and that got me thinking about intelligent design generally, and that's how this book arose.
Well, let's start off with talking about this particular issue of ID in physics and cosmology. What do you think of the arguments for ID from the fine-tuning of the laws of physics?
Right. So I think it's interesting to consider what consequences we should draw from the fact that some of the fundamental constants of physics seem to be fine-tuned for life, in the sense that if the value of the constant were slightly different than it actually is, life could not exist in the universe. Some people say that this provides evidence for the existence of God. Other people say this provides evidence for the existence of many universes, where in different universes the values of the fundamental constants are different. And so in most universes there wouldn't be life, but in some there would be. There are a variety of interesting philosophical issues here. Some people, like Richard Dawkins, take the multiple universes hypothesis to basically show that the theistic fine-tuning argument doesn't work. They try to say, no, the fine-tuning evidence doesn't provide any evidence for the existence of God because instead we can postulate multiple universes. And in my book, I show that Dawkins' reasoning is fallacious. Appeal to multiple universes might have some force in showing that the theistic fine-tuning argument is unsuccessful, but they can't prove that the theistic fine-tuning argument is unsuccessful in the sense that one should still take the fine-tuning evidence to provide evidence, some evidence for theism, even in the face of the multiple universes hypothesis. I go through it in detail in the book so people can see how it works. Some of these arguments are slightly complicated or sophisticated, but I think that's part of what's interesting about the whole debate, is that sometimes I see people dismiss the fine-tuning argument very simply. Oh, that argument doesn't work because, and then they say something quickly. And it's way more complicated than that. I can explain why the simple dismissals don't work, and one would have to look to more sophisticated arguments if one wants to try to set aside the theistic fine-tuning argument. So the very fact that one can have this sophisticated intellectual discussion with reasonable arguments on both sides, where it's not clear what the resolution is, that already shows that the intelligent design debate is worth taking seriously.
Well, Professor Monton, I agree with you. Your arguments about the evidence for cosmic fine-tuning were very complicated, and I would definitely encourage readers to read the book to really get a good sense for what you're arguing. Sometimes I felt like you had some interesting comments to make. Other times I was not convinced by a couple of your arguments in particular, one of which was that you critique an argument that William Lane Craig has made, which basically has three parts. It says, premise one, everything that begins to exist has a necessary condition for its existence. Premise 2, the universe began to exist. Conclusion, therefore the universe has a necessary condition for its existence. And then, of course, Craig would go on to argue that the necessary condition is God or some kind of a designer. And one of the interesting and surprising things I thought that you challenged premise 2, which is that the universe began to exist. And most people who attack, they pretty much leave that one alone. Most people just take it as a given that the universe exists and that it began to exist at some point. So is this a strong objection to this argument? And if so, why do you think it is?
Well, Craig gives two sorts of reasons that he thinks the universe began to exist. He gives philosophical reasons. He thinks that the universe had to begin to exist. And I set those aside for the purposes of my book, that I do happen to think that they're on. And then he also gives empirical reasons that we should think the universe began to exist, namely that the universe started with a Big Bang. And what I try to show is that Craig's appeal to the physics there isn't as strong as one might think. Specifically, what Craig is appealing to is classical general relativity. He's not taking into account quantum effects. He's not taking into account the work that's being done to generate a theory of quantum gravity. And later in Craig's work, he does somewhat take that into account, but I think he doesn't do so adequately. So I try to argue that it's actually a very much an open question whether the universe began to exist. It could well be the case that the universe has been in existence forever. And if the universe has been in existence forever, then that, I think intuitively that's at least more palatable to an atheist, that one doesn't then have the question of how did the universe come to exist? What, if anything, caused the universe to come to exist?
These are concepts where I admit it's difficult to wrap your mind around. If the universe existed forever, does it still cry out for a cause? Why does the universe exist forever? Maybe quantum gravity, which I'm not very much an expert in, explains this. But, I mean, any comments from you?
They're great philosophical questions. I mean, we're really getting at like sort of the deepest questions in philosophy. Does the universe have to have a reason for its existence? Does it matter whether the universe began to exist or whether it's been in existence forever? These are questions that philosophers have been thinking about for thousands of years, and they're questions where physics seems to potentially have something to say about them. And so I think this is what excites me the most about philosophy. I'm not going to try to give an answer now other than to say it's really fascinating to think about.
Sure. Well, and I would encourage listeners to read the book, Seeking God in Science, an Atheist Defense Intelligent Design, because there's no way that I'm going to summarize your arguments sufficiently, Professor Monton, and I think that people should read the book and think about these issues for themselves, because these are fascinating questions that you talk about. Another issue that you talk about, obviously, is the argument for ID in biology. And you look at the origin of life, and you look at irreducible complexity. Which of those two do you feel is a stronger argument?
So I try not to get into the details of those debates, precisely because so much other literature on intelligent design gets into the details of those debates. But there are certain issues that I think haven't been adequately discussed in the literature, and so those are the ones I take up in the book. Specifically, what hasn't been adequately discussed is the hypothesis that the universe is spatially infinite, and what impact that hypothesis has on the biology-based design arguments. So I argue that if the universe is spatially infinite, that shows that some of the standard biology-based design arguments aren't as successful as people think, but I also show that it doesn't preclude one from giving a biology-based design argument in principle. Now, I'm not saying that the universe definitely is spatially infinite, but it is a hypothesis that is a reasonable one to consider given the evidence that we have from physics, and I think it does have impact on the biological debates. And this is a point that hasn't been made in the literature before, so that's one reason I'm excited about that portion of my book.
It's kind of like the multiverse hypothesis in a certain sense, and you're just trying to increase your probabilistic resources to account for highly unlikely events. And so in that sense, is it subject to any of the same criticisms of the multiverse hypothesis?
It's subject to some of the criticisms, but not others. And I take issue with some of the stuff that Behe says. Behe has discussed the multiverse and how it relates to his arguments, but Behe has not discussed my hypothesis being that this universe is spatially infinite. Behe hasn't discussed how that relates to his arguments. So I point out that some of Behe's complaints about the multiverse don't apply to my argument about the single universe that we're in being spatially infinite. For example, one of the standard complaints about the multiverse is that we can't get evidence for the other universes. And that may well be right, but we can get evidence that our universe is spatially infinite. We don't have conclusive evidence, but we can get some evidence for that, or so I argue in the book.
Well, Professor Monton, we talked in the previous podcast about blogging heads and how people are trying to take down Behe's interviews there. I personally think that a debate on blogging heads that I think would be fascinating would be to see you have a dialogue with Bruce Gordon, who is here at the Discovery Institute and also has a background in philosophy of physics. I think that this would be an absolutely fascinating subject for you guys to talk about, because me not being an expert, would love to listen to experts like the two of you talk about these questions of the nature of the universe and whether or not the universe is infinite or eternal or finite, and all these deep questions that you're raising right now. Well, I want to close this interview out with a discussion of your view on education. And one of the things I really like about your book is that you state from the outset, and this is the point that many critics either just ignore or miss somehow, is that Discovery Institute does not favor mandating ID in public schools. And we've been very clear on this, I think, for those who are willing to listen. And I appreciate the fact that you were very much listening to that point, because people often miss that point. So you close your book talking about education. So let's ask the big question that often gets people most riled up. How do you think this issue should be dealt with in public schools, or at least in education in general? How do you think that this topic of origins and evolution and intelligent design should be dealt with?
I think it's a complicated issue, but I think that there are situations where it would be appropriate to talk about intelligent design in the science classroom. And I don't think it's unconstitutional to do so, but even if it is unconstitutional, fundamentally what we should care about is pedagogy. We should care about how best to educate our students, how best to make them productive and well-reasoning citizens in the world. And the best way to do that could well be to talk about intelligent design in the science classroom. Now, that does not mean that we would be teaching intelligent design as true. I don't know anyone out there who thinks we should do that in the science classroom. And that does not mean that we would be giving intelligent design equal time. And again, I don't think that's even part of the contemporary debate nowadays. And sometimes people talk about this issue where they focus on equal time, or they focus on, well, we shouldn't tell students that intelligent design is true. And yeah, I mean, no one's really saying that. What they want is the students to know that there is a debate, that some people disagree with the standard naturalistic evolutionary story and have alternative ideas. And I think it would be worth letting students know that. It could be helpful for the students to see arguments for and against the different views that people have. And it's okay for the students to know that most all scientists think that the evolution-based intelligent design arguments are wrong. But given that the students will often be hearing anti-evolutionary views from their family or from their pastor. I mean, if you just look at American opinion polls, you can see that most Americans are not on board with naturalistic evolutionary theory, providing a full account for life on Earth. And given that most people think otherwise, I think it's worth talking about those views. It could be worth talking about those views in the classroom.
Well, Professor Monton, we appreciate the work that you have done to write this book. I think it's a very thoughtful book, and I think that our listeners should definitely check it out because it's a unique book, and you won't find anything else like it out there. It's titled, again, Seeking God in Science, An Atheist Defends Intelligent Design, published recently by Broadview Press. Again, Professor Bradley J. Monton, Associate Professor of Philosophy at the University of Colorado Boulder, is the author, and I really appreciate the time that you've taken to talk about these issues and your new book on the podcast with us, Professor Monton.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. This has been great.
Well, we look forward to your next book on this topic and the further work you're going to be doing. Again, Professor Monton also has a blog. It is bradleymonton.wordpress.com, or you can check out his homepage, which is bradleymonton.com. So, Professor Monton, thanks again for talking about these issues with us. I'm Casey Luskin with the ID of the Future podcast. Don't forget the book is titled Seeking God in Science, An Atheist Defends Intelligent Design. Thanks for listening.
This program was recorded by Discovery Institute's Center for Science and Culture. ID the Future is copyright Discovery Institute 2008. For more information, visit www.intelligentdesign.org or www.idthefuture.com. Welcome to ID the Future, a podcast about intelligent design and evolution.
Greetings and welcome to the ID the Future podcast. I'm Casey Luskin, and today we have on the show with us Professor Bradley Monton, Associate Professor of Philosophy at the University of Colorado Boulder, who's the recent author of the book Seeking God in Science, An Atheist Defends Intelligent Design, published by Broadview Press. Some of you will remember Professor Monton, who we had on the show last year, talking about his support for intelligent design, even though he's an atheist. So I really appreciate you coming back on the show with us today to talk about your book, Professor Monton.
Thanks for having me.
Now, I have to admit that a long time ago, you actually sent me a review copy of your new book, which I read almost in its entirety and very much enjoyed. And I don't think I ever told you this, but I never actually got around to typing up the notes that I took on many of the pages of the book and giving you feedback. So I'm going to publicly apologize to you, Professor Monton, for not giving you feedback, even though I did enjoy the book very much. And I imagine that the published version is probably just as good. Well, I want to give you a lot of airtime today to talk about your own views on this topic and let you explain your views to our listeners. So you start off the book by saying that, quote, "This book is not providing a full-fledged endorsement of intelligent design, but intelligent design needs to be taken more seriously than a lot of its opponents are willing to do." I suspect we'll get into questions of where you and I agree and disagree on ID arguments a little bit later in this podcast. But for now, I'd like to ask you the question, where do you feel ID needs to be taken more seriously, and what are ID's opponents doing that shows you that they aren't taking it very seriously?
Well, one of the main things that frustrated me about ID opponents, and one of the reasons I got into writing this book in the first place, is the philosophical arguments being given against intelligent design. So I'm a philosophy professor. That's where my primary training is. I also have a background in physics. And I saw a number of, what purported to be philosophical arguments for why intelligent design shouldn't be taken seriously or shouldn't be treated as a legitimate intellectual endeavor. Specifically, people were arguing that intelligent design isn't science, for example, or that we couldn't possibly get evidence for God or some sort of designer of the universe. Those arguments struck me as fallacious, and I wanted to set the record straight. And that was my primary inspiration for writing the whole book.
About 10 years ago, I remember Philip Johnson speaking at UCSD, giving a lecture to a packed-out audience of over 500 people, where he basically said that people need to take ID more seriously. And here you are, 10 years later, making the same complaint, so to speak. So, do you feel that things in this department have gotten worse or better in the last 10 years as you have followed this debate?
My suggestion would be that things have gotten better in the sense that ID is talked about a lot more within the intellectual community than it has been. And I'm not the only one who has this view. Obviously, there are lots of theistic philosophers who have this view. Though, of course, there are theistic philosophers who are opposed to intelligent design as well. But I'm more interested in the atheists and what the atheists who think intelligent design is worth talking about. For example, there's John Roberts, who's a tenured philosophy professor at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and he wrote a blurb for my book where he said, this is a great book. These ideas need to be taken more seriously. We need to put them on the table. Ned Hall, who's a philosopher at Harvard, he gave a talk at the University of Idaho last year talking about how intelligent design should be discussed in school. Brandon Feidelson, who's a professor at University of California, Berkeley, has written a paper that in part criticizes the judge's decision in the Dover trial and takes issue with the sort of reasoning that suggests that intelligent design isn't scientific. So there's a number of people, not just me, who have this view. And then in conversation with people as well, people who don't have any bone to pick in this debate, a lot of them are saying, yes, I find it amazing how virulent the anti-intelligent design opponents are and how it doesn't seem warranted given the state of the evidence on the two sides. And I'm talking about not just everyday people. Everyday people are great, but I'm talking about, professors, philosophy professors who are educated people and are especially trained to evaluate arguments.
That's a very interesting perspective that you have, Professor Monton, and I think that it makes a lot of sense. I think that sometimes the extreme vitriol that people respond to ID with makes sort of reasonable people think, what? Why is this provoking such a strong response? And I appreciate the fact that your book is really trying to encourage people to take ID more seriously. So I think it's a good step in that direction, absolutely. Another thing that I appreciate your book, and you mentioned this a few minutes ago, is that you tackle many of the common misrepresentations of ID, that it's trying to bring theocracy, that it's not science, all these sorts of things. And you use one of the main promulgators of these conspiracy theories, Barbara Forrest, as sort of your antagonist at the beginning of the book, and I guess she makes it pretty easier for you. But could we talk briefly about some of these common misrepresentations or bad arguments against ID? Because I can see that you're very good at getting past those to talk about the real issues.
Sure. Yeah, Barbara Forrest says intelligent design is the most recent version of creationism. She says it's a code for religious belief in a supernatural creator. And she says the goal of the intelligent design movement is to gain equal time for creationism in American public schools. And she goes even crazier. She says that intelligent design proponents are trying to undermine secular constitutional democracy. And all this is just either false or completely misguided, or actually both, probably. Intelligent design theory is different than creationism. If you take any sort of standard definition of creationism, it's not young earth creationism. It's not the view that species were specially created. So it's a different doctrine than that. It's not essentially supernatural. Intelligent design theory is about saying that there's evidence of some sort of cosmic designer, designer of life on Earth. That designer could well be God, and it could very well be the case that most all intelligent design proponents believe that that designer is God. But that doesn't mean that intelligent design itself is a supernatural doctrine. The doctrine itself is about there being a designer, and then there's a further question about what the nature of the designer is. Also, intelligent design is about a lot more than teaching in schools. Just because some intelligent design proponents think it should be taught in schools doesn't mean that the scientific, or at least scientifically related doctrines themselves have anything to do with that. It strikes me from all my interactions with intelligent design proponents, it's rather just silly to say that they're trying to undermine secular constitutional democracy. But even if they are, it doesn't matter for the truth of their scientific-based arguments.
Very true. But it certainly makes good headlines, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, when you say intelligent design proponents are trying to undermine secular constitutional democracy, when you say they're proponents of theocracy, yes, that does prick people's interest.
And now you talk about defining creationism and how it's different from ID. One of the things that I found very interesting about your book, and I have to say when I read your draft, I was actually surprised, but pleasantly surprised that you did this, because I don't think very many people have taken the time to do this. But you spend a lot of time in your book just talking about the definition of intelligent design and how do we define ID. So I'd like to ask you, why do you spend so much time in your book talking about the definition of ID?
Partly because there's been such confusion about this in the literature and debate about this. There's such debate about whether intelligent design is supernatural or not. And there's debate about what the nature of the designer is that intelligent design proponents are talking about. And there's debate about what is the difference between intelligent design and creationism. And I thought it would be helpful to wade into that. And it was sort of a morass from my experience reading the literature and talking to people. And I wanted to set it all straight and just get it, all on the table and discuss all the relevant issues. And I think the discussion is really interesting. It raises really interesting issues about, for example, the nature of explanation in science and what it is to appeal to a designer as an explanation for some sort of physical process. How there could be some aspects of reality that don't have an explanation at all, and what that has to do with the hypothesis that there's a designer. So when one gets into it, it's not just a question of, what exactly is the definition of intelligent design. It gets into lots of interesting philosophical issues about what sort of evidence one could get for intelligent design doctrine and how the different parts of the intelligent design arguments relate to each other. With regard to the latter point, how the different parts of the intelligent design arguments relate to each other, some intelligent design arguments focus on evolution. In fact, that seems to be the ones that most people focus on in the literature. But then there are other intelligent design arguments out there as well, like arguments based on the origin of life. And oftentimes people consider physics-based arguments to be intelligent design arguments, like the fine-tuning argument. The fact that the fundamental constants seem fine-tuned for life, in the sense that if the value of the constant were slightly different than it actually is, life couldn't exist. Some people say that provides evidence for the existence of God. And this is often considered to be an intelligent design argument. So I think it's interesting to look into all that and try to see what the relation is between the physics-based arguments and the biology-based arguments.
Yes, I thought that was one of the most helpful parts of your discussion of the definitions of intelligent design, in that you really brought out the fact that ID is not just limited to biology, and people often forget that. And even some critics of intelligent design in biology, people like Ken Miller, say that they accept the evidence for design in cosmology. And so these are very important distinctions to make, and I really think that you did a good job. I think that someone who reads your book, Professor Monton, will not come away with very many misconceptions about what intelligent design is.
And I just want to say, since we're on this topic and since I'm talking to you, that it's not like I talked to or got advice from Discovery Institute people on any of this. I criticize the Discovery Institute statement of intelligent design. I say in my book, that statement doesn't work at all. Let's see
Yes.
if we can replace it with something better. So I remember you offered to give me comments on my book, and I said, well, actually, it's too late. It's already gone to press. So, I didn't want to become a vehicle for the Discovery Institute or anything like that. I want to maintain a critical stance, but when ideas are on the right track, or at least worth discussing, I'm going to say they're on the right track, and I'm going to say that they're worth discussing.
Yes, I have my whole marked up version of your draft sitting right next to me right now, Professor Monton, that has never been sent back to you. So you definitely didn't get any feedback from me, at least. But I think that you make a good point. I mean, and I think it's important for people to remember that ID is much bigger than Discovery Institute. I mean, it's not like Discovery Institute owns the copyright to intelligent design or something like that. And so it's actually really great to see folks out there taking these ideas, moving the ball down the field and refining them. And I think that many of your criticisms, the kind of constructive criticisms that you bring out in your book, are actually very helpful. Well, we're coming probably to the end of the first discussion of your book for this first podcast. So can you stay with us for a second podcast, Professor Monton?
Sure.
Okay. Well, again, for our listeners, the book is Seeking God in Science, An Atheist Defends Intelligent Design, recently published by Broadview Press by Bradley Monton, Associate Professor of Philosophy at the University of Colorado Boulder. I highly recommend it. As the subtitle suggests, this is a book by an atheist who is taking ID seriously and gives a very thoughtful treatment of the subject. So thank you, Professor Monton, for being on the show with us.
Thank you, Casey.
I'm Casey Luskin with the ID the Future podcast. Stay tuned for more with Bradley Monton on his book, Seeking God in Science. Thanks for listening.
This program was recorded by Discovery Institute Center for Science and Culture. ID the Future is copyright Discovery Institute 2008. For more information, visit www.intelligentdesign.org or www.idthefuture.com.